So this morning was all about quality, not quantity. That's the way to look at it. Other pastors have said to me, like an All Blacks test never impacts your church. I said, yeah, whatever. But in a way, as we think about that, I'm kind of glad, actually, that there are some guys who are watching the test this morning, because one of the things that we're going to talk about in the next 3 weeks or so we're going to introduce a series called Crazy Busy. And we live in a society that is incredibly busy. Can we all testify to that? We can, right? And the thing is to see is that Julie and I, over the last 4 years, we've gotten to know the vast majority of you rather well. And I mean, obviously for others, we're still growing in that relationship. But over this period of time and getting to know you all, I think the Lord's really laid on my heart a little bit of an observation that also applies to me in some senses, because when people talk about me, I've heard that one of the things that they often say is, well, that guy is really busy, right? And I mean, that's just something that I've picked up. And because of this busyness, I've come to realise that actually a lot of us here are actually very, very tired people. For some people there is a very deep sense of fatigue, and for anyone who's been in that place, it's not a nice place to be. But I just want to say that this is typical of our generation, and it's typical of the times in which we live. I believe that we are a tired generation who, because of the stress of life and everything, we are also a very time-poor generation. Some of you, who were born last millennium, probably around the 70s or before that, you will remember a time in our society where in a week, it's almost like New Zealand came to a stop in one sense. For you young people here, believe it or not, once upon a time you couldn't actually go to the shops on a Sunday, right? Because it was all closed.
Or Saturday.
Or a Saturday, sorry. Well, no, I think it was up until lunchtime, or was it just Saturday or something?
When I was a child, it was not at all.
Not at all? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I might be a bit younger because I seem to remember the Saturday morning thing, but it's sort of... Yeah. But look, hey, the simple fact is that there's been this big shift in our society, and it concerns me, by the way, when I talk to, like when I was a kid, it was almost like the days seemed to last forever, right? The days were long, and it concerns me when I hear children talk about how fast time is going. So there's been that shift in our society. This tiredness that I referred to, by the way, it's not hard to find evidence about it. You just jump on the Stuff website and you'll look at practical tips of how to handle stress. Are you busy? Busy people need to exercise, and all these kinds of things that go on. So it's very much a society recognised thing. Gordon MacDonald makes a statement in his book, a very famous book called Ordering Your Private World. I'd recommend that book to anyone. But he says that the term workaholic is actually a modern term. He says that no matter how hard we're willing to work in our competitive world, there always seems to be someone willing to put in a few more hours than we are. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. I certainly did, especially in the corporate world. But the interesting thing is, as I've thought about this, what the strange thing is about our society is that we're very busy, and yet so much of our busyness is also around leisure. There's kind of like, there are industries in this country built on leisure. I grew up in Rotorua, which of course is the tourism, one of the tourism capitals of New Zealand. And that's a classic example of this, But often you get people who will go down to a place like Rotorua, they'll crash in for an afternoon, pack everything in, stay the night, hit the road the next morning and come back and wonder why they still feel quite tired. There are also companies, organisations, retail, chain stores, all these things are committed to providing the goods to help us to enjoy to pursue fun and leisure. And if we're honest within our homes, especially those of us that have got kids, we probably have more time and more gadgets for leisure than we ever have had before. Partly that's to do with the internet. I mean, if you think about you guys, you know, if we were to clock up the hours that you would spend on the internet each week, because all that's related to work and schoolwork, eh? Oh yes, of course it is. Yeah. That's right. We have the model student, but not you guys, but the other guys, right? Is that a lot of that's all leisure-centered stuff. For me as a kid, I grew up in rural New Zealand. I grew up on a farm or close to a number of farms. And I think I was kind of a little bit I was a remnant of a generation that if you had grandparents that grew up in New Zealand, a lot of these grandparents actually had more of a rural type lifestyle, right? Would that be fair enough to say? And cartoons like Foot Rock Flats and all of this stuff reflected that because everyone got it. My children now look at Foot Rock Flats and they go, "What is this?" Right? Because they just don't understand the basic stuff. The instantaneous nature now of leisure. Right? You think about that. So, leisure for me as a kid was I grew up in a community where our house was across the road from a pond, a railway track, a graveyard, a massive bush block. Right? And my parents obviously gave us freedom to roam these things. And they did. My mum always used to say, "Oh, they'll come home when they're hungry." And now, like I think about that, you know, when I was a kid, where this big bush block is, it was at a low point in the community, and so what would happen was when it poured with rain, all the water used to rush into this bush block, and we had rafts all ready to go in the bush. And so I remember that, I mean, I can see mothers going, "Oh, but we did. We used to raft around. I mean, it wasn't overly deep, it was maybe knee deep or whatever, but it was still like this thing. My wife, when she hears these stories, has kittens, you know, because you would never let children do that now. So now, our kids find instant leisure on the internet, on Facebook and Twitter, DVD movies, PlayStations, gaming consoles, and sports, and other recreational organised activities. And yet, even so within all of this, people still feel tired. So the question is this: why is there so much exhaustion and fatigue today? Is it real, or is it imagined? Or is our contemporary form of exhaustion evidence that we no longer understand genuine rest? And I believe that there is a biblical view of rest that needs to be rediscovered and reapplied, relearned. Okay? This is for me as well. Just putting it out there. This biblical view of rest is tied into the concept of Sabbath, which God himself initiated at the creation of the world. And I think it's very important, briefly, I won't go into this, just do a little snapshot thing, is that before we look at the importance of the application of Sabbath, we need to put Sabbath in its context. So we're going to do a little bit of a biblical survey, alright? Because one thing that I've learned about Sabbath is that you can focus on one text and you can come up with all sorts of ideas around it, but actually take it out of context. So I'd like us to do a little bit of a survey with that. So if you've got your Bibles here, you can follow along, or I'm going to put some of you here, that's all right, I'm going to put the scriptures on the screen as well. But, so where does Sabbath first show up in the Bible? Genesis chapter 1, talk about start at the beginning, right? Start at the beginning. But we see in Genesis chapter 1 that God creates everything. He creates it all in 6 days. And he rests on the 7th. And in Genesis 2, verses 2 to 3, which we're going to put up there, it says this: "By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested." Right? That became holy because he rested. Which is interesting. And he rested from all of the work of creating that he had done. So, right at the beginning, we learned that the Sabbath was actually what? It was a day, right? Specifically, it was the seventh day. It became known as Saturday, obviously. It was also a day that began in the evening, and it ended at sundown the next day. Very important to understand that devout Jews still look at a day as beginning at sundown. So when does our day end? Anyone? Are you sure? Midnight. Very good. That's right. And so we measure our days from midnight to midnight. But Jewish culture measures the day from sundown to sundown. Think about that one for a second. For you. Now, Exodus 31, so we jump along a bit more, and it gives us further insight. And it says this in Exodus 31:17. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he abstained from work and rested. Right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that when you look at the King James Version, the Bible of all Bibles, it reads, he rested and he was refreshed. That's what the language says. If you translated it literally, it could say, he refreshed himself. No one else refreshed him, he refreshed himself. So then we fast forward to Exodus 20, and we see that Moses had led Israel out of Egypt. He's taken them to Mount Sinai, and as part of this process of making Israel God's people, he calls them to make a covenant or an agreement with him. And this covenant or this agreement is now what you and I basically know as the Ten Commandments. Alright? And at the heart of the Ten Commandments, oh, by the way, I need to apologise to you guys who were here a couple of Wednesday nights ago, where we had my self-assurance kicked in, and I did some ad-libbing on the spot, and we had a debate about what the third commandment was, and I was wrong. So I'm just putting it out there, I got the order wrong. And it was fantastic. There's a group of people that put me in my place. It's just wonderful. Very good. So we're going to look at the fourth commandment this morning, but it reads this in Exodus 20, 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. How did God keep it holy? It was holy because he rested. Right? 6 days you shall labour and do all of your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. That does not mean E.T. or anything like that. Area 51, nothing like that. We're talking about the alien people from other nations, right? For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the seas and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. And it's interesting that when you look at the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, this is the one that's got the most instructions about it. If you think about the others, thou shalt not murder, full stop. You shall not commit adultery, full stop. There's all these things, but this one has this information package that goes with it. And this was actually the heart of the covenant. This is coming up to the halfway point, and it's quite interesting. The first part of the covenant is all about God. The fourth one, have a Sabbath and remember him. That's what that's all about. And then everything else is about living right in light of these things. But if they obeyed the covenant, then God promised that Israel would be a blessed people. But not only would they be a blessing to themselves, they would be a blessing to the nations, to the world. However, if they strayed from the covenant, then they would become a cursed people. Now, when we look at this closer, without going into too much depth, it's important to note that when the people rested, the animals rested, and the land rested. And in its context, Sabbath gives all of creation a rest. Okay? But as time goes on, and the history of Israel unfolds, we see that eventually Israel strayed from the covenant, and the curse of disobeying the covenant came back on them. And what was the consequence? The consequence was that years later, God raised up the Babylonian Empire to come and take them into captivity. That's what the scripture says. Nebuchadnezzar was God's man of the moment. let's have a look at that text section. 2 Chronicles says this. He, I've written here Nebuchadnezzar, carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burnt all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So putting this time in context, we see that when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, the land was desolate. There were idols and false gods in the land. The people's hearts were away from God, and essentially the nation was a mess. But the interesting thing to note here is what is written in verse 21. And it said this. Next slide, please. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed. So we learn from this text and from others that the 70-year period of captivity that the Israelites spent in Babylon was the exact amount of time that they owed God in terms of the number of Sabbaths that they owed him. Right? Isn't that interesting? So just because they had not taken the Sabbath seriously doesn't mean that God wasn't taking it seriously. And God collected on what they owed him. And it's interesting that during that time, what happened to the land? The land rested. 70 years of Sabbaths were owed and God collected on his debt. That makes you think. But anyway, we fast forward now to Mark 2, this morning's thing. That's just a simple background snapshot. But this event takes place about 500 years later. Christ has come on the scene. And yeah, let me back it up a bit. Israel served her time in Babylon. She was there for 70 years. Paid her debt. Then, as we looked at Nehemiah in the last couple of weeks, they started coming back to Jerusalem and sort of fixing the place up. The law was reintroduced, and life was never the same again. All right, for the Jews. However, by the time that Jesus came on the scene, 500 years after they went home, there were so many additional rules and regulations around the Sabbath that the nation of Israel, under the guidance of her religious leaders, were completely missing the point. And so Jesus, I love this guy because he was self-assured and he was a stirrer. And we see what he did to push this point. It says in Mark 2, I'll read it again. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as the disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them," amazing statement, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, Jewish tradition stated that there were like 39 acts that were strictly forbidden on Sabbath. Massive list. Whereas Moses originally had intended that you went to work on the Sabbath, but apart from that, he didn't really give too many specifics. It was like this general principle. Okay. The other thing he did, say you weren't allowed to do was you were not allowed to do business on the Sabbath. But unlike the lack of specifics that Moses left, Jewish tradition went into great detail, right? And even informed the people on how far they could travel on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to travel more than 200 cubits on the Sabbath. So how do you track that? Anyway. But in short, by the time that Jesus comes around, the Sabbath day had become this crushing burden. And for the average Joe blogs on the street, you get the impression that they actually started to get worried about Sabbath day because it was just, it was this religious bondage that had captured the entire nation. So when Jesus began to openly violate the Sabbath traditions, it was almost like he was declaring war on the religious establishment. And of course he says this, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was not given to enslave people. It was given to refresh people. It was not meant to be, it was meant to be a blessing to the people, not a curse or a burden. So, that's the principle. There we go. Very, very simple. So we fast forward to now. 2,000 years later, here we are, sitting here this morning. By the way, some of you who are remotely intelligent at this point may have picked up that the Sabbath, on the seventh day, something has changed between the whole Saturday and Sunday thing. We're sitting here we've often heard it said that Sunday is our Sabbath, right? But you might be wondering, how did the change come from Saturday to Sunday? Because, you see, in the Bible, there is no argument for Sunday worship whatsoever. Nowhere in the Bible does Christ or the apostles order the Sabbath to be changed at all. But effectively what's happened is we sit here this morning on a Sunday morning because originally people who had come to Christ were Jews. I'm just making this as the Reader's Digest version, alright? They were Jews. They would go to church, they would go to synagogue on Saturday, as the tradition was, and they would use that time to try and win people to Christ. So this was Jews infiltrating Jews. Okay, what actually happened, as far as the historians think, was that the initial thing was about gathering on the next day to initially debrief what was going on. A couple of hundred years later, an emperor comes along who then basically grabs the system and then imposes this first day of the week as Sabbath for what became the Christian Empire, which was the Roman Empire. So it was all a big mess. And so we're inheritance of that. Okay? But the important thing is that it's a principle. That's what we're pulling out, right? Because it's not the seventh day that's the fundamental issue here. It's the role of the law and our liberty in Christ. That's the fundamental issue. Because if you look at the books of, Galatians, Colossians, Romans, they all go on about the importance of not falling trapped to external rules and regulations. It's about a heart relationship. And in fact, we'll put up a slide there. We've got slide 9. Colossians 2:16 says this: "Therefore do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day." The New Testament makes that very, very clear. To complete our line of Sabbath, by the way, going from Genesis to, Revelation, is that the prophet Ezekiel had a vision about the future temple. And he says this about the Sabbaths. He says this in Isaiah 66: "As the new heavens and the new earth that I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so will your name and descendants endure. From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow down before me, says the Lord." So there's something that happens where everything gets pulled back into line in the future. The Sabbath will be honoured in the future temple in prophet Ezekiel's vision. And he says that the gates of the inner court will be closed for 6 days and only opened on the Sabbath and on the day of the new moon. So, putting all that aside, I find that stuff fascinating. And you go, well, that's great. But what does it mean for me today? It's in putting the Sabbath day in context that we can understand principles that we can apply to our lives, which will ultimately make us better disciples of Christ. You see, all of this raises some very important questions for you and I as followers of Jesus. When Jesus said the Sabbath was made for mankind, not mankind for the Sabbath, He meant that we need to have a time of restful recentering ourselves on God. What he was saying is that as people, all people, we need genuine, refreshing, restful rest. Have I made it clear enough? Genuine, refreshing, restful rest. And obviously, apart from the physical and psychological and emotional reasons, I want to suggest to you that the answer as to why we need rest is found in the definition of discipleship. What is discipleship? Discipleship is essentially the rule and reign of Christ in our lives, in individuals and communities. It's the commitment to the moment-by-moment decision to put Christ first in all circumstances. You see, you and I, and I've said this before, we are not responsible for things that happen to us. There's stuff that happens to us outside of our control. We go home, there's been an earthquake, the house is blown up, whatever, right? So a family member has a heart attack, for example. That's outside of our control. We are only responsible for the way in which we react to that. That's what God holds us responsible for. A couple of years ago, I remember, I was in a football match, and I have a bit of a reputation when I play football to play off the opposition psychologically with each other, so they tend to argue amongst themselves. And it's kind of, it's just who I am under that moment. But anyway, two of these guys clicked on to what was going on, and effectively I'd taken a shot at goal and I missed, and one of them came up behind me and actually punched me in the back of the head. The other one then put his foot out and I was down. All under heat of the moment stuff. I hadn't actually really done anything. I just dropped hints and maybe I learned the other guy's name and called his name and then passed the ball. Anyway, it was just all good fun. I thought it was good fun. Anyway, I'm lying there on the ground and these guys are leaning over me and really starting to go to town. And of course, for those of you that play football, you know the chain reaction that happens, right? And of course, there's all these red hot blooded men in their 40s. Really, the whole thing. But what had happened is that I didn't react. Right? What had happened when I was there on the ground, because what had happened up until that point was just simply a game. I hadn't done anything wrong in the rules or anything like that. But if I had handled that wrong, you see, the first thing that came to my mind was actually these guys are created in the image of God. You need to be careful about the way that you react. Right? And so what happened was everyone else reacted. And then the guys after saying, why were you upset? So it's only a game, don't panic, it's only a game. Right? There are bigger issues. Because that's genuinely how I felt. And I had to be very, very careful because I also knew that these guys knew that I was the pastor. And so there's everything that goes with that. Right? But what happened was, Julie pointed out when I got home, she says, actually, your inner reserve is pretty good at the moment. And it all came back because I've been spending time with God, I've been taking a break, had things in the right context. And so that's why it's really important. I had maybe I had a little bit of control, but what happened was that it was through that controlled response that led to this big discussion in the team. And it was really, that was really interesting. But so being punched is a really good way to have a spiritual check upon oneself. And you have, because you have to have inner strength to react in the right way. Do you hear what I'm saying? And I think that those people who really take the concept of the Sabbath and taking a break to recenter themselves on God do take on board inner strength. And if you think about what Christ went through, and you look at the way in which he reacted, that guy had inner strength. And we're called to be like that. If you've been whipped and the whole thing, and what was his last words? Apart from it is finished, but he's, Father, forgive them for what they do. They don't know what they're doing. The guy was nailed to a cross, and he still says, forgive them. That dude was strong. But it all came because he spent time in the Father's presence. So, genuine rest, I'm just going to put it out there, has three elements to it. The first element is this, is that true rest involves reflection. Right? Because what happens is when you're sitting by yourself, you cannot help but reflect that up to that point, right? And God knew that. That's the whole thing. We know that we are resting, I believe, when genuine reflection takes place. What did God do in Genesis? When God rested, he looked upon his work, he enjoyed its completed appearance, and he reflected upon its meaning. And God saw that it was good. That's the repetitive phrase after each break, right? He reflected. And when you go through the Old Testament, you see that the Israelites were told time and time again not to forget what God had done for them. Don't forget it. Right? Because he knew that if you remember the story, then you recenter yourself properly on what God has done for you. If you don't take time to reflect, I actually think what happens is you get stuck on the mundane treadmill of life. Right? People wait, I've known people who have gone through their lives, been very successful in their career, and they suddenly hit a point and they go, well, what was all that about? Right? And I'm sure some of you can think of that as well. But there's something about actively stopping, and as part of that genuine rest, you reflect. So I believe as followers of Jesus, we need to look at our work and ask questions like, what does my work mean? Who did I really do it for? How well was the work done? Why did I do this? Why am I doing this? What results did I expect and what did I receive? I think the Sabbath day was actually put there to actually interrupt our work. It's meant to interrupt. And it's actually meant to be an inconvenience. Because, if you're a driven person, it'd be very easy to be doing other things today, right? But we need to pause and need to do that. A restless work style produces a restless person. What goes on month after month without a genuine pause to inquire of its meaning and purpose may help the bank account and enhance the professional reputation, but it will drain your inner world of vitality and joy. What did Jesus say? You can gain the whole world, but what's the point of doing that if you lose your soul in the process? So, it's all good stuff. So anyway, the first thing is true rest involves reflection. But secondly, true rest is happening when we pause to sort out the truths and commitments by which we are living. So true rest also focuses on the present. We get bombarded every day with messages competing for our loyalties. Whether it's what we watch on TV or what comes home in the school notices or, people come, because, there's thousands of really good things we could be involved in. And so we're emotionally pushed and pulled in 1,000 different directions. And we're asked to make decisions and value judgments. We are pressured to invest our resources and our time into all sorts of things. But what is the standard truth by which we make these decisions? In a previous life, I used to build these horrible drink machines that you see in KFCs and all those restaurants, with the fizzy machines. And the thing with those machines is that so much liquid goes through them that every 6 weeks the whole machine has to be recalibrated. And it takes about 2 hours to do that. You've got to strip it down, you've got to remeasure everything out. And the reason for that is because liquid, for those of you that know, flowing water and liquid, it doesn't matter how good your systems are, it's just an incredibly damaging thing. And so what happens is that you'll be in these restaurants, you pour a drink, and then suddenly your taste buds will go through the roof because A, it's either so sweet, or B, it's water, right? And if you've ever been there and you've seen people up at the counter going, oh, what is this rubbish drink? The whole thing, it's just gone out of calibration because it's been overused. And I think it's a good illustration because we get stuck in the mundane journey of life and we don't take time to recalibrate often, and then everything gets out of whack. So making space is a way of recalibrating. It's a way of pulling everything back into balance. And I believe that when we do that, we have this byproduct of inner peace. And You know, I think about Steve this morning. He's up there facing this massive thing that he's got to go through in his life. But actually, if it all goes wrong, this is big stuff. And so, at the moment, you know, we were talking about it last night. This is where the rubber hits the road, and it turns out that he's actually been in an interesting space in the reflection of his journey with God of recent times. But he said there's nothing like lying in a hospital bed facing your mortality that suddenly, you know, we're going to see if things work. So, are you at peace when you lie in bed by yourself at 2 a.m. in the morning? Because if you're not, then my hunch is that you probably haven't been taking time to recenter yourself on God in your life. That's what I'm just putting it out there. And if you're not at peace, then the good news is that you can be. Jesus, of course, immersed himself in the Sabbath principle. He did it all the time. You know, he withdrew to pray. Even in the midst of chaos, he took time to be alone with God. And the thing is that if we take time to pray and read and reflect, we reaffirm our commitments and our direction in life. So when we put the first two elements of Sabbath into practice, that is reflection and taking time to sort out our commitments, so the past and the present, we get the strength to handle the external stuff, all of the stuff that we have no control over. And so the third element actually prepares you for the future. Right? It prepares you for the future. You know, when I'm lying there on the ground having just been punched out in a soccer match, to lie there and actually, the first thought that comes to my mind is actually these guys are made in the image of God and I have to be careful. Right? So there's the whole respect thing that comes in there. I'm not saying they were right, but, and there was something that came up at that moment. And it was because at that time in my life I had been taking the Sabbath, you know, very seriously. So when we rest in the biblical sense, I believe that we renew our commitment to pursue a Christ-centered tomorrow. And you suddenly find yourself reacting the way that Jesus did in certain circumstances. Because you keep that lens of what the world is like through God's eyes on. So remember, while people were sleeping, Jesus was often praying. When did Jesus get alone? He often got alone. He had to fight for the quiet. You see, he withdrew. The world wasn't going to make space for him. He had to find it. When you think about that, and you think about the calling he had in his life, you know, no wonder he didn't fight back. Because when you look at the passage to the journey to the cross, this is an unnatural journey for any person to take. So, in the words of Gordon MacDonald, his private world was ordered. How's your private world this morning? Because this is what we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks. And if we can help you get recentered or a pattern in your life where you actually, if this is about going deeper in him, then that's the actual aim of the series. So by way of a response this morning, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask the team to come and play. And as they do that, they're going to play Christ is Enough. But what we're going to do for the response time is, while they play, it's just going to be a time of reflection. And I'm going to put some questions up. Can I have that next slide? And I want you to just simply sit, and I want you to answer these questions for yourself. It's just after 11:15. We're going to take a good 5-10 minutes to do this. But it says this. The questions are this. When or how do you slow down regularly? Because some of you might sit here and go, far out, what does that mean? I don't even have a pattern of doing that. So part of that is, what does Sabbath rest look like to you? So please understand that the scriptural principle is a day, but I think that when you look at Jesus' life, this whole idea of withdrawing and making time, that's the key thing. It's about the relationship, not the religious duty, because that's what Jesus was going on about. You know, the day was made for man, not man for the day. In other words, the day is to be refreshing. It's not a whole lot of rules and regulations. So that's the first thing. What barriers or obstacles are there in your life preventing or tempting you from slowing down? That's a big question. And all of us have a different journey, so I just want you to sit with that. And I want you to then, because there is a sense of realism with this, in the sense of the what do you call it, the byproduct of not following the Sabbath, is what happens when you ignore these signals to slow down. And there's a question there. Has this happened to you recently? So that's how our response will go. I just want us to reflect on those things, and if you feel that you would like prayer to make a recommitment to what it means to be connected to God, then please come up front for prayer. But if I can get you to leave here this morning, because these are foundational questions for the next couple of weeks, okay? And while this is introducing the idea this week, in the next couple of weeks we want to give you some practical aids to help you in that. Is that all good? Cool. Would you like to take it away?